By its nature, the game of basketball is oftentimes a near-perfect example of the saying, what you see is what you get. The best players that the game has to offer, more often than not, look as great as the box score says they are, and you can watch in real time as the supreme passing talent of a Jokic or the insane athleticism and shot-making ability of an Anthony Edwards propel them to amazing box score performances and, most importantly, wins. But ever so often in the league, there comes a player who has the perfect blend of athleticism, scoring prowess, and shooting ability, with all of the intangibles to make themselves an all-time great of the game and a winner, but it never happens. Sometimes it's injury, sometimes it's poor performance, and every time it's just bad luck. But for one player in the modern era, it seems like it's been all of these things, yet the story of his consistent lack of success has routinely left fans divided on the root of his failures. So in today's video, we're going to be looking at the career of Zach Lavine, his inability to translate his production into team success, and discover what happens when the eye test doesn't translate. Though we're going to be jumping around a bit and this won't be a full career recap, it's important to briefly look at Lavine's pre-NBA career and examine the language surrounding him as a prospect, because a quick glance at his scouting report reveals that many of the same issues he had as a prospect would plague him throughout his NBA career. After spending his freshman year at UCLA, Lavine's unique skill set had garnered a lot of attention from NBA scouts entering the draft, with his size, athleticism, and 37.5% clip from behind the three-point line, all coming together to create a rare breed of player that had next-level potential in the NBA. In his pre-draft scouting report on Lavine, Daniel O'Brien of Bleacher Report described Lavine's offensive potential by saying, quote, "If he can reach his ceiling, he'll be an uncontainable weapon." Phrasing that's already interesting when examined in hindsight, but becomes all the more intriguing when you read the end of O'Brien's report, where he continues on to say, quote, "Lavine's outlook 3 to 5 years from now depends largely on his grasp of the finer points of the game and ability to develop advanced skills." This scouting report and the discussion around Lavine as a prospect is especially interesting because it helps get at the nuances of superstardom, and the idea that explosive scoring, both in the box score and on the court, aren't the indicators of impact in the league, and the finer points of playmaking, defensive effort, and overall leadership of your team can all be easily overlooked in the superstar conversations, yet they're the most important part in determining who earns the label. Regardless, as we all know, Lavine's potential would still lead to him being drafted 13th overall to the Timberwolves, where he'd spend the first 3 years of his career adjusting to the league as a scorer, with his third season being prematurely ended with an ACL tear. But his days in Minnesota aren't meant to be the focus of this video, and for our intents and purposes, Lavine's story begins on June 22nd, 2017. When the Chicago Bulls, seeking to launch themselves into a new era, sent Jimmy Butler to the Wolves for a haul that included Chris Dunn and Zach Lavine. With Lavine entering his 4th season at this point, both he and the Bulls were facing a difficult path to success, with Zach being forced to miss all but 24 games of his first season in Chicago with ACL and eventual knee soreness, and Chicago, for their part, had officially ousted all of their veteran leadership in hopes of contention, leaving a massive leadership void in the locker room that someone would eventually need to fill. Still, by all accounts, this was a solid display for the brief time Zach was able to be on the court, with his averages of 16.7 points and 3 assists on 38.3% from the field and 34.1% from 3 on 5.1 attempts a game not being great, but the lingering effects of his ACL bogged down a year that had some really nice performances, with the best one coming on February 9th, where he detonated for 35 points to deliver Chicago a home court win against his former team. Lavine's highlight reel 35 came on a mixture of dunks, catch and shoot jumpers, and pull-up mid-range buckets, which all served to build the excitement in the Bulls fans about their new acquisition. And interestingly enough, with Chicago walking away with a win, it helped to mask the 38 points that Butler was able to put on Chicago, where he targeted Lavine in isolation on more than a few key buckets. Ultimately though, with the season already being a wash and Lavine recovering, this year was looked at as mostly a success, and the real test would begin in the 2018-19 season. as Zach cemented himself as the face of Chicago, while also beginning one of the more heated player-coach feuds that we'd ever seen. In what was his first full healthy season since 2016, Lavine jumped to an unprecedented level offensively, averaging a career-best 23.7 points and 4.5 assists on a much better 46.7% from the field and 37.4% from three on 5.1 attempts a game. Numbers that only scratched the surface of just how important he was to the Bulls' offense. He would jump to the top of the league in usage rate at a 31%, which placed him in the 99th percentile of all wings, while also jumping to the 95th percentile of assist percentage, assisting on a whopping 22.5% of all of his teammates' made shots. Despite the Bulls having the second worst offense in the league, sporting just a 104.5 offensive rating that placed them 29th in the NBA, as an individual piece, it was undeniable that Zach lifted Chicago, with the team scoring 3.9 points per 100 possessions more when he was on the floor and having a 1.7% better effective field goal percentage with him out there. Numbers that came together to give him a plus 4.7 efficiency differential for the season that placed him in the 79th percentile of all players. All of these advanced offensive metrics helped mask the still underdeveloped defensive ability of Lavine. And while the Bulls as a whole were underwhelming, with their 112.8 defensive rating placing them 25th in the NBA, Lavine's struggles as an off-ball defender saw him ranked 15th out of 22 players on Chicago's roster in individual defensive rating with a 112.4. Still, for the first time in his career this season, as the face of a franchise, Lavine had cemented himself as one of the best players in the league, with the Bulls losing ways and lack of success ultimately being chalked up to youthful inexperience, and Lavine quickly garnering a reputation as a budding young star who could lead the Bulls back to glory with the right help. Unfortunately, the 2019-20 season would be the start of one of the more tumultuous eras in his career. See, what I neglected to mention in the 2018-19 season was that longtime Bulls coach Fred Hoiberg was fired, with associate coach Jim Boylen taking over for him just 26 games into the 18-19 season. Boylen was known as a passionate coach, headstrong in his beliefs that the fundamentals of basketball, the IQ game, the passing, and most importantly, the defensive effort would be the key to winning. And as such, Boylen's hard-nosed demeanor and questionable timeout decision-making put him in direct opposition with Lavine and the rest of the Bulls roster on numerous occasions. But perhaps no single example was more representative of the differences between the two and really of what would come from Lavine's career than their mid-season blow-up against the Charlotte Hornets. For context, frustrations were already high to begin the season, with the Bulls' 5-11 record already causing tension and Jim Boylen's decision to repeatedly call timeouts with the game already out of reach, having only added to the growing rift between the players and their coach. But after a November loss against the Heat, where Lavine only managed 15 points off the bench and was benched by Boylen for what he described as, quote, 3 egregious defensive mistakes, the late November meeting between the Hornets and Bulls looked to be just yet another chapter in the contentious book that was the 1920 Bulls season. But when the ball tipped off, Lavine used this stage to send a message, dropping 49 points and connecting on a career-high 13 threes, with his final tray being a game winner that not only delivered Chicago an improbable victory, but fully shifted the tides of the media and the Bulls organization against Boylen and his criticisms. This clash with Boylen over his hard-nosed coaching philosophy and hyperfixation on the defensive end is yet another key moment in Lavine's career. Because while Boylen's methodology and approach undeniably didn't work for Lavine or the rest of the Bulls roster, his general sentiment of wanting more defensively from a player as gifted as Lavine wasn't necessarily incorrect. In fact, under Boylen, Chicago's defensive rating dropped to a 108.9, the lowest it had been in the Lavine era, and good to place them at 9th in the NBA. And what's more is, Lavine would actually finish 15th in steals this year with 1.5 a game, and Boylen's hyper-switchy defensive scheme gave way for Zach to have some impressive moments on ball as a gifted athlete with quick hands. And in their 118-116 win over the Cavs in January of 2020, while it was his 21 fourth quarter points en route to a 42-point night that dominated the headlines, Lavine's 5 steals were crucial to this win, is the Bulls held Cleveland to just 14 fourth-quarter points with a whopping 10 turnovers to secure a comeback win. But this isn't a Jim Boylen defense video, and while Lavine would end the 1920 season strong, Boylen's firing in August of 2020 was met with celebration by Bulls fans and likely players, with the organization hiring Billy Donovan, who was fresh off a near Coach of the Year campaign with the Thunder. And as a result, the 2020-21 campaign saw Lavine reach unprecedented offensive heights. He'd average a career best 27.4 points and 4.9 assists on a mind-boggling 50.7% from the field and 41.9% from three on 8.4 attempts a game. Numbers which rightfully earned him his first All-Star selection and cemented him as one of the most uncontainable offensive weapons the league had to offer. But Lavine's growth came as a product of the larger shift that Donovan brought in. And rather than a focus on team defense and switchability, the Bulls, who did stay top 12 in defensive rating, focused more on their offense. And according to Andres Waters of 538, Lavine was one of 7 Bulls players who saw a jump in their effective field goal percentage this season. And in mid-March, Chicago was one of 4 teams to rank top 10 in field goal, 3-point, free throw, true shooting, and effective field goal percentage. But while Lavine thrived individually, this still ended up being yet another bunted season, as late season falters ultimately saw the Bulls lose in the play-in, with their hopes for the 21-22 season being substantially higher behind the flashes of offensive improvement the team had shown at points during this season. And these expectations would be kicked into overdrive on August 11th, as DeMar DeRozan would be traded to the Bulls to form what was simultaneously one of the most offensively talented and defensively challenged big threes the league had to offer, with Lavine and Nikola Vucevic, who was acquired in the middle of last season. And together, with the additions of Lonzo Ball and Alex Caruso, this looked to be the core that would end the Bulls' playoff drought. And this would come so close to being the season Bulls fans had been waiting for, as the team improved massively in the win column, with their 6th-seeded finish not telling the whole story of the season, as Chicago at one point had managed to occupy the number 1 seed behind their mix of offensive brilliance from Lavine and DeRozan, a solid quarterbacking effort from Lonzo, and the combined defensive excellence of Caruso and the rest of Chicago's role players. Lavine would earn his second All-Star selection behind his averages of 24.4 points and 4.6 assists on 47.6% from the field and 38.9% from three on 7.1 attempts a game. Finally relieved of his duties and expectations of being a lone star, and instead finding success depending on contributions from DeRozan and the playmaking of Lonzo Ball to lift the team to heights that he alone never could. Unfortunately, in a game against the Warriors, Lonzo Ball's knee troubles would begin with a torn meniscus in January of 2022. In the same game where Lavine would go down with knee troubles stemming all the way back to his ACL tear in 2017. And what was once looked at as a dream season for Bulls fans was quickly falling into a tailspin. And while Lavine would return just 5 games later, the loss of Lonzo did a number on Chicago, whose 27-13 record prior to his injury fell to just a 19-23 record to round out the season. And with Lonzo's loss already hurting the team's playmaking and defense, the loss of Alex Caruso to a fractured wrist put a spotlight on just how poor Lavine, DeRozan, and Vooch were as a defensive trio, and how much the quote Big Three depended on 2 of their role players to stay afloat. As from January 23rd to March 9th, all games which Caruso and Ball missed, the team netted a 116.5 defensive rating that placed them 27th in the NBA over this span, depending purely on their offense to keep them afloat, where they had a 115.6 offensive rating that placed them at 10th in the NBA, and a true shooting percentage of 59.9%, which placed them 4th. But the team's defensive woes can't be understated, and in fact, through this span without Lonzo and Caruso, the Bulls' most played 5-man lineup of Lavine, DeRozan, Vooch, Ayo Dosunmu, and Javonte Green had a horrendous 121.5 defensive rating, which was the worst in the NBA amongst lineups that played at least 85 minutes through this span. And so despite what began as a picture-perfect season for Chicago, the loss of Caruso and Ball ultimately led the Bulls into a first-round matchup with Milwaukee where they were handily outclassed, losing in 5 mostly uncompetitive games. Chicago's lost season can again act as a perfect commentary on who Zach Lavine had began to become in the eyes of the front office and fans. Because his offensive skill and efficiency, which had once been lauded as, quote, uncontainable, and set him up to be one of the most promising number 1 options in the league for the foreseeable future, had quickly maxed out with Chicago unable to secure a playoff appearance. And now, their aspiration of contention had essentially been rested on the backs of Lonzo and Caruso, who had been brought in to compensate for the defensive and playmaking holes in Lavine's game. And though they didn't know it, the 2022-23 season served as the Bulls' last real chance to make a run at contention, and the highs and lows of the year perfectly captured the Lavine era in Chicago. To begin the year, the team was already in disarray, with the hope for a speedy Lonzo Ball return quickly evaporating. And now Chicago, who had managed to be in the 100th percentile of isolation efficiency as a team last year, were again forced to depend on DeRozan and Zach to carry them offensively. And to their credit, both guys were again excellent in isolation, with DeRozan scoring 1.15 points per 100 ISO possessions and Lavine scoring 1.09 points, numbers that placed them in the 88th and 83rd percentile respectively. But as a whole, the Bulls felt the impact of this isolation approach, with the team ranking 20th in the league in assists at 24.5 a game and 25th in assist to pass percentage, which measures the percentage of teams' passes that lead directly to assists, all coming together to give them an offensive rating of 112.8, which placed them at 24th in the league. This year, it wouldn't be the Bulls' offense that shined, but the team defense, which finished with the 5th best defensive rating in the league this year at a 111.5, but did so by at times making the difficult but not entirely unfamiliar decision to bench Lavine, who despite playing on the 5th best defense in the league, still saw opponents score 1.3 points per 100 possessions more with him on the floor, placing him all the way down in the 41st percentile of all players in the NBA. Lavine's benching in a November loss to the Magic again brought back the memories of Boylen's public dispute with him some years ago, with Zach now having years of lackluster defensive effort and a clear offensive ceiling pulling against him. And at season's end, with the Bulls missing the playoffs and losing a heartbreaker to the Heat in the play-in, the plans to end the Zach Lavine era in Chicago had begun to pick up steam. And unfortunately, the 2023-24 season would be snatched away from Zach Lavine by a foot injury that ended his year prematurely, forcing the Bulls to bunt yet another campaign and fully commit to a rebuild in the 2024 offseason. But in the process of shipping DeMar DeRozan and Alex Caruso out to acquire youth, reports came out that the Bulls were struggling to find a trade partner. And in the words of ESPN's insider Bobby Marks, by June of 2024, there was, quote, literally no trade market for Zach Lavine. And as we all now know, the 24-25 season would be something of a return to form in terms of availability and production for Zach, with him eventually being sent to Sacramento where he reunited with DeRozan. But the lack of a trade market for Lavine can act as the final note in what's been a years-long saga of the perception of Zach Lavine to the broader league, and a definitive marker of his value to the NBA. While he was never expected to come in and be this league-altering force as a prospect, through his time with the Bulls as a number 1 option, he managed to play his way into legitimate superstar conversations, with his mixture of high-flying dunks and jump-shooting efficiency painting the picture of a prototypical number 1 option to lead the Bulls into the future. Yet, despite having all the physical tools to be great, Lavine's shortcomings as a defender, playmaker, and at times inconsistent offensive option from both a production and availability standpoint routinely manifested to stomp out the Bulls' aspirations for contention. Whether it was a public feud with a coach who was asking for the same defensive effort he gave on offense, or the construction of a new team roster built specifically to help fill the offensive and defensive holes in his game, or the eventual deterioration of this roster to injuries, every attempt by Chicago to build around their number one guy only proved more and more how unfit he was to be their number one guy. And to be fair to Lavine, basketball is of course a team sport with every guy on the floor being equally as responsible to help deliver their team a victory. And it's impossible to put all of the blame on a single player when a team has failed so consistently. But in the same breath, Chicago did choose to build around him with massive contracts and specially made rosters to complement him. And it's nearly impossible to win as a team when your best player can be your weakest link in so many scenarios. Regardless of his previous history though, with the Lavine era underway in Sacramento, and a similar team composition seeking to make a push in the West this upcoming season, there's truly no telling what they could achieve. But whatever happens in Sacramento, things are sure to be different over the next couple of seasons. Because thanks to the Lavine era in Chicago, we've all been able to witness what happens when the eye test doesn't translate. But with all that being said, that's going to do it for this one. Hopefully you enjoyed, and hopefully I can catch you in the next one.